The archive ring was the quietest place in the fleet, which was precisely why Thomas loved it, and precisely why no one important ever came here on purpose. It drifted slightly off the main station, like a polite afterthought, a circular corridor of glass, metal, and softly glowing data shelves that hummed with stored centuries. The hum was constant, low, and reassuring, like the universe clearing its throat and deciding not to speak after all. Thomas sat at his usual desk near the eastern viewport, a place chosen not for prestige but because the chair there only squeaked when you leaned too far to the left. He had learned this the hard way. He was currently cataloging a shipment of pre-unification star logs that no one had requested in 50 years, which made them perfect. No deadlines, no admirals, no conversations that began with, "This will only take a moment." A maintenance drone hovered nearby, trying very hard to look useful while slowly bumping into a shelf. Thomas nudged it gently with his foot. "Careful," he murmured. "That's classified boredom you're endangering." Outside the archive, the fleet was alive with motion, carriers aligned and realigned, shuttles stitched light across the void. And somewhere beyond the glass, Admiral Kyrisa was walking through the central promenade, trailed by officers who had practiced their smiles in reflective panels and nobles who believed silence was a form of seduction. Thomas did not see any of this. He was busy correcting a misdated entry about a moon that no longer existed. The doors to the archive slid open with a sound so soft it felt apologetic. Thomas did not look up. People rarely came in, and when they did, they usually announced themselves loudly, as if afraid the books might attack. Instead, footsteps approached with measured confidence, unhurried, unafraid of quiet. Thomas frowned slightly. That was unusual. A shadow fell across his desk. He glanced up, already preparing his polite explanation about restricted access and proper authorization codes. What he saw made his mind stall, not in awe, but in mild administrative confusion. The woman standing there looked human at first glance. Same proportions, same familiar geometry of face and posture. Then his eyes adjusted, and he noticed the ears. Longer than human, elegant and tapered, sweeping back along her hairline like a deliberate deviation from a standard template. Her uniform was unmistakable. Admiral's insignia, fleet command markings, the kind of presence that bent rooms around it. Thomas stood up so quickly his chair protested loudly. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "This section is restricted unless you're lost, in which case you're still restricted. Just temporarily." She studied him with an expression that was not stern, not amused, but deeply curious, as if he were an unexpected paragraph in a familiar book. Without responding, she moved past him, around the desk, and sat in the empty chair beside his. The squeak did not happen. Thomas noted this with irrational offense. Then she took his hand. It was warm, steady, entirely real. Thomas's first thought was that this must be a misunderstanding. His second was that there was definitely a protocol for this, and he had definitely not memorized it. His third was that if he moved too quickly, he might trigger some kind of diplomatic incident, or worse, a conversation. "I believe," he said carefully, staring at their joined hands as if they might explain themselves, "that you may be confusing me with someone who enjoys attention." Her grip tightened slightly, not possessive, grounded, like someone anchoring themselves during turbulence. The archive remained quiet. The maintenance drone stopped bumping into things, which Thomas took as a bad sign. She did not speak. She did not need to. The silence wrapped around them, thick and almost kind. Thomas realized with distant horror that he was holding the hand of the most pursued woman in the fleet and thinking primarily about how he was going to file this moment later. Personal anomalies, perhaps, or unresolved phenomena. Outside, alarms did not sound. No one burst in. The universe unhelpfully continued exactly as before. Thomas cleared his throat. "If this is a test," he said, "I should tell you that I failed my last evaluation on social adaptability. They said I treated people like reference materials." For the first time, her expression softened. Not into a smile exactly, but into something close enough that it warmed the space between them. She stayed like that for a long moment, then another, and another still. Thomas stopped counting. The archive hummed. The fleet chased. And in a quiet ring of forgotten knowledge, An alien woman with long ears sat beside a librarian who had never once thought to look for her and refused, without realizing it, to let go. The first thing Thomas noticed after she left was that the chair beside his desk still felt occupied. Not physically. There was no residual warmth detectable by any reasonable sensor, but in the way a room remembers a sound after it stops. The archive hummed exactly as it always had, yet the silence had acquired a shape, and it was irritatingly hand-sized. He stared at his fingers for a long moment, turning them slightly as if expecting to see a warning label. Nothing. No diplomatic seals burned into his skin. No glowing alien glyphs. Just his hand, faintly trembling, which he decided to blame on dehydration, and not the fact that Admiral Carissa had just held it like a decision. The maintenance drone resumed its slow, apologetic collision with a shelf. Thomas exhaled. "Don't," he told it. "I can't handle symbolic commentary right now." He sat down, then stood up again, then sat back down with more commitment. His console blinked patiently, waiting for input. He typed a single word, incident, stared at it, then deleted it. He tried interaction, deleted that too. In the end, he logged nothing, which felt dangerously honest. Outside the archive, the universe had noticed. By the time Thomas left his station to retrieve a stack of obsolete language cores, the first whisper reached him through the ventilation system, carried by voices that assumed walls were allies. "Admiral Carissa, the librarian. Did you see where she sat?" "No, not that librarian. The other one." "No, the quiet one. The one who never looks up." Thomas paused, hugging the stack of cores to his chest. He considered turning around, hiding among the shelves until the fleet forgot how to breathe. Unfortunately, the fleet was very good at breathing. When he returned to his desk, someone was waiting for him. Lieutenant Harrow, Logistics Division, immaculate uniform, expression permanently fixed halfway between curiosity and disbelief. "Thomas," Harrow said, leaning casually against the desk in a way that suggested practice. "Roughly 37 people are currently arguing about you." Thomas set the cores down carefully. "That seems excessive. Admirals are involved. That seems unnecessary." Harrow smiled thinly. "So, how long have you known her?" Thomas considered this. "If we're counting minutes, approximately 8. If we're counting emotionally, I believe the answer is 0. Harrow blinked. "She held your hand." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "That part happened." "Why?" Thomas gestured vaguely at the archive. "I was sitting." Harrow stared at him as if searching for hidden sarcasm. Finding none, he straightened. "You understand that people have been courting her for years." "I don't," Thomas said, "but I believe you. Strategic alliances, political favors, marriage proposals delivered via encrypted sonnets." "That explains the noise," Thomas murmured. Harrow leaned closer. "And she chose you." "She sat next to me," Thomas corrected. "Choice implies intention. This could have been a navigational error." At that exact moment, the archive doors slid open again. The room did something strange, like holding its breath without being asked. Admiral Carissa entered alone. No escorts, no entourage. Her uniform was unchanged, but her presence felt different, quieter somehow, as if she had left something important behind and come back to retrieve it. Her long ears angled slightly as her gaze settled on Thomas, then flicked briefly to Harrow. "Lieutenant," she said. Harrow snapped to attention so fast he nearly saluted the wrong direction. "Admiral." "You may go," Carissa said gently. Harrow hesitated, looked at Thomas, looked at the Admiral, decided wisely that oxygen was preferable to curiosity, and left. Carissa walked to the desk and sat again in the same chair. The squeak still did not happen. Thomas made a mental note to file a complaint later. "You did not run," she observed. "I considered it," Thomas said, "but I don't know where admirals are allowed to chase librarians, and I didn't want to violate zoning laws." A pause, then, unexpectedly, she laughed. Not loudly, not politely. A quiet sound surprised into existence. "I have frightened you," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied, "but not in the top 10 ways." She studied him again, that same focused curiosity, as if he were a puzzle that refused to be challenging. "Everyone else stares," she said. "You don't." "I work with fragile artifacts," Thomas said. Staring too hard tends to end badly. Her fingers brush the edge of the desk, close but not touching his hand this time. They see my rank, my species, my value. And you'd prefer, Thomas ventured, to be seen as, she considered, tired. Thomas nodded immediately. That's very visible, actually. She looked relieved. They sat together in the quiet, the archive humming around them, data cores glowing softly like patient witnesses. Outside, the fleet continued its endless motion, still chasing, still reaching. Inside, an alien woman with long ears rested beside a librarian who had never competed for her attention, and found for the first time in years that no one was asking her to be anything more than present. By the third day, Thomas became certain the fleet had developed a personality disorder, and that disorder was named after him. He discovered this when a junior officer attempted to casually browse the archive while clearly not knowing how to read. The officer picked up a data slate upside down, nodded thoughtfully at it, and then asked Thomas, far too loudly, whether the shelves were emotionally stable. Thomas answered that the shelves were fine but tended to judge silently. The officer left immediately. Words spread in inefficient, creative ways. Someone had seen Admiral Carissa return to the archive twice. Someone else had seen her sit beside Thomas again. A wildly inaccurate rumor suggested Thomas had once saved her life during a hyperspace malfunction, using only a book and a calming tone. Thomas was impressed by this last one and briefly considered living up to it retroactively. The archive, once ignored, became a pilgrimage site for people pretending not to be there. Thomas noticed them hovering near the entrance, adjusting uniforms, suddenly fascinated by obsolete star atlases. He also noticed Carissa watching them with mild amusement, her long ears tilting in ways that suggested she heard more than anyone else and enjoyed very little of it. They are circling, she observed one afternoon. They do that, Thomas said. We have a very confusing floor plan. She smiled faintly. It vanished quickly, as if smiling were a resource she rationed. That was when Commander Relvek arrived. Relvek was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed the sort of confidence that assumed gravity existed as a courtesy. He entered the archive like someone expecting applause, and stopped short when he saw Carissa seated beside Thomas, her hand resting near his, close enough to be intentional. Admiral, Relvek said, bowing just enough to be theatrical. I had hoped to speak with you. You are speaking, Carissa replied calmly. Relvek's gaze flicked to Thomas. In private. Thomas raised a finger. I can leave. I don't technically belong to anyone. Carissa did not look at him. Stay. Relvek's smile tightened. This man is irrelevant. Thomas considered this. Historically accurate, he said. Relvek ignored him. Admiral, your presence here has caused speculation. The Council is concerned. About what? Carissa asked. That you are being influenced. Thomas leaned back in his chair. I can barely influence a maintenance drone. The drone, as if summoned, bumped into a shelf. Thomas sighed. Carissa turned fully toward Relvek. Everyone who approaches me wants something, she said. Titles, alliances, access. This one does not. Relvek scoffed. Then he lacks ambition. Yes, Carissa said. That is the appeal. Relvek straightened, clearly offended on behalf of ambition everywhere. This is unbecoming. Thomas nodded. I've been told that about my handwriting. Relvek left in a storm of controlled outrage, his boots echoing like punctuation marks. When the doors slid shut behind him, the archive seemed to relax. You could have dismissed him, Thomas said. I could have, Carissa agreed, but I wanted him to hear it. She shifted slightly closer, not touching, just enough that Thomas was acutely aware of the space between them. He felt strangely calm about it, like noticing gravity had increased slightly, but deciding to sit down instead of panic. They will escalate, she said. They always do. Do they duel? Thomas asked. Because I bruise easily. She laughed again, quieter this time, and something in her shoulders loosened. No, she said. They negotiate, threaten, maneuver. I'm excellent at shelving, Thomas offered, if that helps. It does, she said simply. Later, alone again, Thomas realized the tension had not vanished. It had merely changed shape. He was no longer invisible. He was a variable. And somehow, impossibly, The most powerful woman in the fleet found rest beside him. He glanced at the empty chair next to his desk and allowed himself a small, private smile. The universe was vast, chaotic, and endlessly ambitious. But here, among forgotten knowledge and humming shelves, something unchased had finally chosen to stay. The archive learned her schedule before Thomas did. He noticed it in small ways. The maintenance drone stopped bumping into shelves 15 minutes before she arrived, as if anticipating judgment. The ambient lighting softened without command. Even the hum of the data stack seemed to settle into a lower, steadier register. Thomas suspected this was coincidence, but he had cataloged enough strange patterns to know when coincidence was simply being polite. Carissa began coming at the same hour each cycle, slipping into the archive as though she had always belonged to its quiet orbit. She never announced herself. She never asked permission. She simply appeared beside Thomas's desk, sat, and allowed the world outside to continue without her. Today, Thomas was reading a translation log from a failed first contact mission involving a species that communicated exclusively through seasonal metaphors. He looked up as she sat. "You're early," he said. "I escaped," she replied. "Impressive. From whom?" "Everyone." Thomas nodded. "That tracks." She rested her hands on the desk this time, palms down, fingers long and steady, her ears angled slightly backward, a posture he had learned, purely by accident, meant relief. He did not comment on it. Commenting seemed like the kind of thing that broke fragile systems. They sat in silence for a while. Thomas read. Carissa watched the viewport, where distant stars slid past like uninterested witnesses. Eventually she spoke. "Do you know why people chase?" Thomas considered. "Momentum? Fear of stopping? A deep cultural misunderstanding of cues?" She looked at him. "Status," she said. "They chase what they believe will make them more than they are." "And does it?" She shook her head. "It makes them loud." Thomas smiled faintly. "Yes. We've had to reinforce several shells because of that." She turned toward him fully now, studying his face with the same careful attention he gave damaged texts. "You don't want anything from me." "I want the archive to remain climate stable," Thomas said, "and for people to stop trying to reorganize it by color." "That is all?" "For now." She exhaled, slow and deep. "Where I come from, rest is not considered productive." "That's unfortunate," Thomas said. "It's very efficient." She laughed softly, then fell quiet again. When she spoke next, her voice was different, less guarded. "When I was young," she said, "I believed pursuit was affection, that if someone chased you, it meant you mattered. And now? Now I know it means they are running from themselves." Thomas closed his data slate, giving her his full attention without ceremony. "You can stay," he said. "No one bothers the archive for long. It frightens them." "Why?" she asked. "It reminds them how much has already been written." She shifted closer, their shoulders nearly touching. The proximity felt natural, like adjusting to a slightly altered gravity. Outside, the fleet pulsed with activity, messages, orders, ambitions traveling faster than thought. Inside, Carissa's breathing slowed. "Thomas," she said quietly, "do you know what my species calls this feeling?" He waited. "Stillness," she said. "It is rare, addictive, and dangerous." "Dangerous?" he echoed. "Yes," she said, "because once you find it, you stop pretending you don't need it." Thomas considered this carefully. "I stopped pretending years ago," he said. "That's how I ended up here." She looked at him, really looked at him, as if adjusting an internal lens. Then, without ceremony, she placed her hand over his again. This time Thomas did not panic. He did not search for protocol or explanations. He simply allowed it, the way one allows a long-missed silence to settle. Outside the archive, someone was probably planning something ambitious. Inside, among forgotten knowledge and humming shelves, an alien woman with long ears finally rested, and a librarian let the universe slow down without asking it why. The summons arrived in the least dramatic way possible. A blinking indicator on Thomas's console labeled "Mandatory Attendance," misspelled and blinking far too cheerfully for its purpose. Thomas stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Carissa, who was seated beside him, reading a historical record upside down, and somehow understanding it anyway. I believe, and he said, that the fleet has decided I've had enough peace. She did not look surprised. They waited longer than I expected. That's reassuring, Thomas said. I enjoy being underestimated. The meeting was scheduled in one of the central chambers, a place designed to make people feel small through architecture alone. Vast curved walls, floating holographic insignia, chairs that subtly adjusted posture to encourage humility. Thomas disliked them immediately. Carissa walked beside him through the corridor, her stride unhurried, her presence drawing glances that slid off her like rain. Thomas, on the other hand, attracted looks of pure confusion, as if someone had accidentally left a piece of furniture in motion. You don't have to come, he said quietly. I do, she replied. They are not calling you because of you. That's worse, Thomas said. The chamber filled quickly. Admirals, council members, strategic advisors whose expressions suggested they had rehearsed concern in mirrors. Commander Relvek was there, standing slightly too straight, as if daring the room to question him. The discussion began with words like optics, instability, and precedent. Thomas tried to follow, but the sentences looped back on themselves like poorly indexed references. Eventually, someone gestured vaguely in his direction. This individual, the counselor said, has become a focal point. Thomas raised a hand. I apologize, I wasn't aiming for that. Several people frowned. Carissa stepped forward then, calm and unmistakably centered. You are concerned, she said, because I am not behaving as you predicted. That is one way to phrase it, Relvek said. You are disrupting expectations. Yes, Carissa agreed. I am resting. A murmur rippled through the chamber, as if rest were a foreign concept that might be contagious. This is not about personal preference, another counselor said. Your associations reflect upon the fleet. Thomas leaned toward Carissa. I knew I should have worn a better sweater. She almost smiled. I choose where I sit, Carissa said evenly. I choose who I speak to. I choose stillness over spectacle. If that reflects poorly on you, perhaps reconsider what you value. Silence followed, dense and uncomfortable. Finally, the council dismissed them with stiff formality, the kind that pretends nothing has changed while quietly admitting everything has. Back in the archive, the hum felt louder, more insistent, as if aware it was now officially political. Thomas sat heavily in his chair. Well, he said, that went better than expected. No one challenged me to a duel. They will try something else, Carissa said. Of course they will. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. You could leave. Thomas looked around at the shelves, the drifting lights, the quiet order he had built piece by piece. And abandon my post? The archives would collapse into interpretive chaos. She studied him, then nodded. Then I will stay. He glanced at her. That's a significant decision. So is leaving, she replied. You already chose. Thomas exhaled slowly. Outside, the fleet plotted. Inside, among forgotten knowledge and stubborn calm, two unlikely constants held their ground, not against the universe, but gently, as if daring it to slow down. The fleet attempted subtlety next, which was unfortunate, because subtlety was something Thomas noticed immediately. He noticed it in the way supply requests to the archive were delayed by precisely 37 minutes. He noticed it in the sudden interest the security division took in structural safety inspections. He noticed it when a junior clerk he had never met asked him, far too cheerfully, whether he had ever considered a transfer to planetary records on a moon with no atmosphere and unreliable heating. You're being relocated, Thomas said flatly. The clerk blinked. Well, we were hoping you'd see it as an opportunity. Thomas nodded. That's usually how exile is phrased. Carissa listened to all of this with quiet patience, her long ears angled in a way Thomas had come to recognize as restrained irritation. She did not interrupt. She did not intervene. She waited until the clerk left, visibly relieved to have survived the conversation before speaking. They are testing you, she said. That seems inefficient, Thomas replied. I fail most tests by accident. They want to see if you will move, Carissa continued, if you are willing to be displaced. Thomas considered the archive, the shelves he had memorized by touch, the hum that had become a second heartbeat, the chair that only squeaked under specific conditions. "I am," he said slowly, deeply stationary. Her lips curved. "I suspected." The next attempt was less polite. A formal notice arrived, this one spelled correctly and stamped with enough authority to make the console dim slightly in respect. Thomas read it twice, then a third time aloud, as if hoping the words would realize how unreasonable they sounded. "Temporary reassignment," he read. "Pending review of influence metrics." "Influence," Carissa repeated. "You? I once convinced a captain not to dog-ear a first edition star map," Thomas said. "It took 3 hours." She laughed then, genuinely, the sound echoing softly between the shelves. It startled a nearby drone into reversing direction. That night cycle, the archive lights dimmed to their lowest setting. The viewport showed the slow drift of the fleet, enormous and restless, like a school of predators pretending not to notice one another. Thomas sat at his desk long after his shift ended, staring at the reassignment notice. "You could go," Carissa said quietly. "Temporarily." "And then what?" Thomas asked. "They'll learn I'm portable." She sat beside him, closer than usual, her presence warm and grounding. "You are not," she said. "That is what frightens them." Thomas exhaled. "I never intended to be frightening." "No," she agreed. "You intended to be invisible." The realization sat between them, not heavy, but solid. Thomas had spent his life avoiding notice, building a quiet existence where nothing demanded more than he could give. Now, without trying, he had become immovable. The next morning, Commander Relvek returned, this time without pretense. "You are obstructing operations," Relvek said, standing too close to the desk. "The Admiral's behavior has consequences." Thomas looked up calmly. "So does moving the reference section without authorization." Relvek's jaw tightened. "This ends now." Carissa rose to her full height, her posture composed but unmistakably final. "No," she said. "It ends when I say it does." Relvek hesitated. "You would choose this?" "Yes." "A librarian?" Carissa glanced at Thomas. "A constant." Relvek left without another word, his retreat sharp with unspent intention. When the doors closed, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not fear, but acceptance. He reached for Carissa's hand, this time without waiting for permission. "I should tell you," he said, "I'm not very good at standing my ground dramatically." She squeezed his hand. "Good. Drama attracts attention." Outside, the fleet continued its maneuvers, strategies colliding like distant storms. Inside the archive, among forgotten knowledge and deliberate calm, two beings chose stillness again, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. The announcement did not come through alarms or urgent summons. It arrived the way most important things in the archive did, quietly, embedded in routine. Thomas was relabeling a shelf that had been incorrectly categorized for decades when the hum changed pitch. Not enough for panic, just enough to indicate a system-wide message. The shelves dimmed, then brightened again, as if clearing their throats. Carissa looked up from her seat beside him. "That's new?" "Yes," Thomas said. "The archive only does that when something significant is pretending not to be." The message unfolded across the viewport in restrained, formal script. A declaration from Fleet Command, a restructuring, a clarification, really. Admiral Carissa's autonomy was reaffirmed. Her associations were declared non-negotiable. The archive ring was redesignated as a protected neutral space, officially recognized as a cognitive recovery environment. The last line was clearly added by committee and poorly disguised as generosity. Thomas read it twice. "Well," he said slowly, "they've institutionalized peace." Carissa smiled, tired but genuine. They had to call it something. The fallout was immediate and anticlimactic. Commander Relvek requested reassignment to a sector very far away. The council stopped blinking at Thomas like he might explode. The junior clerk returned once to apologize and ask where the restrooms were, clearly relieved to have a normal question again. Life improbably settled. Weeks passed, then months. The fleet continued to move, to negotiate, to posture. But the archive remained what it had always been, quiet, orderly, stubbornly unchanged. Thomas noticed that he walked differently now, straighter. Not with pride exactly, but with presence. He spoke when needed. He no longer apologized for existing. One cycle, as they sat together watching a distant nebula twist like spilled ink, Carissa spoke. You know, she said, my people have a term for bonds formed without pursuit. Thomas tilted his head. I assume it's unpronounceable. Entirely, she said, but it translates loosely to chosen stillness. He considered this. I like that. It sounds deliberate. It is, she said. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the decision not to be pulled. Thomas reached for her hand, familiar now, grounding. I used to think my life was small. And now I think it was quiet, he said. There's a difference. She leaned against him just slightly, her long ears brushing his temple. Outside, stars burned and died at incomprehensible distances. Inside, the hum held steady. The maintenance drone drifted past and bumped into nothing at all. Thomas smiled. The universe did not end. It did not explode into romance or war. It adjusted, begrudgingly, around two constants it had not planned for. And in a quiet ring of forgotten knowledge, an alien woman stopped running, and a librarian finally understood that standing still could change everything. The elders listened, not all approving, but all aware that resistance no longer carried the weight it once did. Ethan spoke too, briefly, honestly, without theatrics, about consent, about partnership, about the difference between survival and stagnation. When it was done, no one demanded exile. No one called for execution. History adjusted its course with the subtlety of a continent shifting beneath the sea. Later, standing on a balcony overlooking the city, Ethan leaned on the railing and watched the lights pulse in slow, organic rhythms. So, he said, no more ancient biotech forcing us into proximity. No more migraines when we disagree. No more gravity-based interventions. Nix joined him, resting her hands on the smooth crystal beside his. You sound disappointed. Just making sure I don't miss the perks, he replied. I've grown fond of not being crushed by reality. She regarded him steadily. You may leave, she said. Return to your world, to your ruins. Ethan nodded. I know. The bond did nothing. He smiled faintly. That's the scary part, isn't it? Nix turned toward him fully, her long ears angling forward. Choice is always frightening. They stood there unhurried, letting the moment settle into something real and unforced. Ethan realized then that he was not afraid of staying, nor was he afraid of leaving. That was new. I think, he said slowly, I've spent my life assuming commitment meant losing myself. Turns out, avoiding it was just another way of staying unchanged. Nix studied him, something soft and resolute in her gaze. And I believed duty required distance. That closeness was weakness. She paused. I was wrong. The city's lights brightened as the night cycle deepened, casting them both in a glow that felt less like ceremony and more like continuation. Ethan straightened, decision settling without the need for drama. I'd like to stay, he said. Not because I have to, not because an artifact says so, but because I want to see where this goes. Nix did not answer immediately. Then she extended her hand. Not a command, not a claim, an invitation. Ethan took it. The bond stirred once more, not binding, not altering, but acknowledging. Then it fell silent, its purpose fulfilled. Somewhere in the ancient systems beneath the citadel, a record updated itself, final and satisfied. Covenant complete. Outcome, mutual choice. Ethan laughed softly. You know, he said, squeezing her hand, for an accidental engagement, this turned out surprisingly functional. Nix smiled, long ears lifting slightly. Do not tempt fate, she replied. It has already demonstrated a sense of humor. Together, unbound and undeniably changed, they looked out over a future that no longer belonged to ancient machines or predetermined paths, but to two people who had learned, against all expectations, how to choose.